Hey guys, welcome back to a brand new video. My name is Harmon. Today I have a very unusual and interesting case for you guys today. I'm here in Seattle, Washington, and I found a very bizarre story of a guy who is the leader of a cult in Oregon, and he was murdered by one of the family members. And so I found his grave, so I wanted to tell you guys the story of who he was and what happened. So make sure you stick around. Let's get into it. So Franz Edmund Kayfield, also known as Edmund Kayfield, was born in 1870 and died in 1906. Again, he was murdered, which we'll talk about that in a little bit. But Edmund was a German-American religious leader who founded a movement in Oregon, and that movement became what was known as the Holy Rollers. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, this movement was a cult. And you'll see why as I talk about Edmund and what he did. So Edmund believed that he was the second coming of Jesus. And so that already gives you an indication as to what he believed and what things he did. Now, not much is known about his early life, but Edmund was born originally in Germany, and information is pretty scarce, but he somehow eventually made his way. He immigrated to Oregon, and his first appearance in Oregon that people recognized him was in 1903. Now, when he arrived in Oregon, he got involved with the Salvation Army, and later that year he was sent to a mission to the town of Corvallis, and eventually, breaking off from the Salvation Army, he formed his own group, and that group, like I mentioned, was called the Holy Rollers. Now, from what I've been reading, it sounds like the congregation of his movement, sounds like they actually did roll around on the floor, and that is why they got their name. Now, how true is that? I'm not sure, but that is what I've been reading. Now, when Edmund first arrived in Oregon and started preaching and organizing the Holy Rollers movement, he didn't say anything too crazy or outrageous at the time. He simply was mainly preaching about the beauty of the full gospel. Soon, however, after organizing the movement, his followers believed he was receiving messages from God. Edmund would preach hours and hours on end, and his followers would loudly roll around on the ground pleading for God's forgiveness. Now, when Edmund had his church services go into the early morning hours, the town of Corvallis put a stop to it and barred him from holding any services within the city limits. Now, when the fall rain season started happening, a lady named Sarah Hurt and her 3 children, Maud, Frank, and May, along with 20 others, again, some of these were Edmund's most faithful followers, to his house just outside Corvallis. Now, in October of that year, which was 1903, the group burned most of the house's contents, including furniture, utensils, heirlooms, and even a cat and a dog. In January 1904, 20 vigilantes called the Whitecaps tarred and feathered Edmund and told him to leave town and never come back. the next day after that happened, Edmund and Maud Hurt were married. In February 1904, Edmund was accused of having numerous relationships with other women and was accused of adultery, which was a criminal offense, and so a warrant was actually put out for his arrest, and even included a statewide manhunt to find him. Meanwhile, most of his followers were spent fasting, praying, and some of them were even committed to the Oregon State Insane Asylum, as their behavior was so bizarre. In July, 1 month after Sarah Hurt was committed to the insane asylum, Edmund was discovered naked and starving under her house. So they finally caught him, and he was naked living under one of his followers' houses. He of course was arrested and sentenced to 17 months in the Oregon State Penitentiary for the adultery crime he committed. When he was released, he of course claimed he was Jesus risen from the dead, and his resurrection would be because he emerged from prison. Edmund had made some other bizarre claims besides claiming he was Jesus. He also claimed that he was responsible for the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. And when his followers were finally released from the insane asylums, they all believed him. In April of 1906, Lewis Hartley, who was a wealthy mine owner, followed his wife Cora and daughter Sophie when they went up to meet Edmund and some of the other followers. But as the group boarded the ferry, Lewis fired a revolver 4 times at Edmund, and apparently Edmund was uninjured. Edmund was able to escape, and that is when he ended up fleeing to Seattle, where we are right now. And he fled to Seattle with, again, his wife Maud. Now this is where the story gets very interesting. I should tell you that one of Edmund's faithful followers was a young woman by the name of Esther Mitchell. Edmund had claimed that Esther was like the bride of Christ. She was like the virgin, someone's super special in their group. And so Esther, of course, was very dedicated to Edmund and the movement. Of course, as you can imagine, Esther's family were very, very unhappy that she was involved in this terrible cult. And so Esther's brother, George Mitchell, ended up finding Edmund here in Seattle, and he murdered him. He shot him point blank. Edmund, of course, died from his wounds in 1906. George Mitchell was actually found not guilty by reason of insanity. And not much later, George Mitchell's sister, Esther, who was the one involved in the cult, she ended up killing her brother, George, as soon as he was released from jail. And so now you have Edmund, who was murdered by George Mitchell, and then George Mitchell was murdered by his own sister, Esther. And Esther was, of course, arrested for killing her brother, and she was sent to a different insane asylum. It's also called the Western State Hospital. And she was sent there for a couple years, but was released in 1909. And she ended up taking her own life in 1914. So just such a bizarre and crazy story. Edmund is buried here at the Lakeview Cemetery in Seattle here. And if you're ever here at the cemetery and you want to find Brandon and Bruce Lee's graves, they're here at the same cemetery, but they're up on top of the hill. And so kind of interesting that Brandon and Bruce Lee are buried here at the same cemetery that Edmund is buried. But anyway, without further ado, I wanted to show you Edmund's grave here. Now what's crazy is there was only one picture of his grave here at the cemetery, and it was kind of like this, but I kept walking around up here trying to find it, and I just didn't walk far enough back. So I'm glad I found it, but anyway, this is the final resting place of Edmund. Some of the writing, like when he was born and when he died, is pretty much faded away by this point, but like I said, he died in 1906. And if you're curious, I did try to find George Mitchell's grave and his sister's grave, but they both are buried in Oregon, pretty far away. All right guys, I'm gonna head out of here. It is absolutely freezing right now. It's like 37 degrees. The sun is going down, so I'm gonna head out. But again, this was just one of those bizarre cases that I was nearby, and I was like, I just want to document this one for you guys. So feel free to comment, let me know what you guys thought about this one. If you're new around here and you want to see more of these kind of crime videos where I go to different locations and film the graves, just make sure you subscribe and stick around. But until then, I'll see you guys next week. Thanks for watching. See you soon and stay safe.